Welcome to Edinburgh, Scotland. I'm Larry Taunton, Executive Director of Fixed Point Foundation, a Christian think tank located in Birmingham, Alabama, and we're at the Edinburgh International Festival, the world's largest and most prestigious cultural festival. We're here in Usher Hall, and here shortly the hall will be full of people who are here to see a debate between Christopher Hitchens and John Lennox. Christopher Hitchens is a journalist, an Oxford graduate, a naturalized American. John Lennox is professor of mathematics and philosophy of science at Oxford University. And the two men will be debating the question of atheism and Christianity. Should Europe prefer atheism or should it prefer Christianity? So we think you're in store for a very lively discussion on what is arguably the most important question of our time.
Good morning, everyone. This is going to be a fairly extraordinary hour and a half, I hope. My role is to try to make it extraordinary in itself, but to stop various things happening, which include stopping John Lennox and Christopher Hitchens going on at inordinate length. One thing strikes me in introducing this debate, and it is that we still see flapping across the landscape from time to time, particularly on the occasions of general elections. We haven't got one at the moment, but who knows. The old canard that public debate is dead or dying or in some kind of semi-comatose state. Events like this, at the festival, at the book festival around the corner, at festivals around the country, give a lie to that. Public debate is alive and well, and there should be a good one this morning, which I urge you to enjoy and participate in. It's my pleasure to introduce the two combatants on my left. Dr. John Lennox, Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University, no less, but also pastoral advisor at Green College, Oxford, a man of science and religion, author of a book which you can find outside, God's Undertaker, Has Science Finally Buried God? And John straddles that imagined divide, as he would see it, between science and religion, and is passionate about bringing the two together in a unity which he sees as very profound. We were talking beforehand about 2 or 3 celebrated occasions in which mathematicians of the higher sort, a company in which he finds himself, have actually fallen asleep in the course of their own lectures by becoming perplexed and amazed by the density and complexity of something they see on a blackboard, incomprehensible to the rest of us. He is someone, however, who not only doesn't fall asleep in his own lectures, but prevents anyone falling asleep during his conversations. I think I can safely say the same of Christopher Hitchens. There is a thing which goes around the world known as the Hitchens delusion, which is that just when you think he can't surprise you anymore, he does. One of Christopher's tomes, which touches on the matters that we'll be debating today, is God is Not Great, a look at the monotheistic religions of which he does not approve. His passion in that direction, of course, being just as great as his passion for the foreign policy of the late George W. Bush, which is one of those collisions that makes him such a surprising and delightful figure on the world stage. Each will speak for 15 minutes. Christopher will propose the motion, if you like to be formal, that the new Europe should prefer the new atheism. John Lennox will take the opposing view. One thing I want to do, and this is something Intelligence Squared and their debates do, and it's very useful, is just to take a very easy, quick, preliminary show of hands. Those who feel that they're in favor of the proposition, those who are against, and perhaps just as important, by show of hands, those who are undecided, and then we can do a sort of before and after thing. Can I just briefly ask you, those who come in convinced that the motion is broadly one that they would support, just show. Right? Those who feel at the moment that it's one that they would oppose, slightly bigger. Those who are genuinely or diplomatically at the moment undecided. That's about the same, and some of you haven't expressed an opinion. We'll see how it is at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, my great pleasure is to introduce Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, very much for a very handsome introduction. The first time I've ever been referred to as a meme. Looking forward to building on that. I want to quickly advise everybody to get themselves to the Hill Street Theatre tonight and every other night and see Max McGuinness's very adventurous play, Up the Republic. That's where I spent my own last evening. The portrayal of President Sarkozy of France has already been described by the French Consul General in Edinburgh as an insult. And when you get there, you'll see why. It's a great honor for me to be back in, actually what are, they might not think it to hear me, the haunts of my boyhood. I was raised for some considerable time in Rosyth and in Inverkeithing. My accent had to be beaten out of me when I later moved to Devonshire. But it's quite something to have been brought up within range of Loch Gelly and its famous implements of punishment. It's only my eyebrow also that conceals from you the scar inflicted on my forehead by a slate in a Protestant Catholic exchange at the playground on my first day at Camden School, a struggle in which I've always since sought to remain neutral. And Edinburgh is, of course, a very apt setting for this exchange, this debate, this much more civilized one. It was in this great city, or at least on the road out to Falkirk, in January 1697, that Thomas Aikenhead, young former Edinburgh student, was executed for blasphemy, having been accused by the Lord Advocate of having called theology, I quote, a rhapsody of ill-invented nonsense, and the Trinity a foolishness, a piece of foolishness unworthy of refutation. The Lord Advocate hoped that this exhibition of Christian barbarism would be followed by further executions and that these would deter the expression of similar opinions. In fact, young Thomas Aikenhead was the last person executed for blasphemy in these British Isles, and Edinburgh since has become much more wholesomely, and I would say now probably indelibly associated with the Enlightenment, with the Old Alliance that links it to the French encyclopedists, and with the imperishable name, of course, of David Hume. Now, it's a pity in some ways that Professor Lennox and I today are not called upon by the terms of the motion to dispute metaphysical or moral truths in respect of religion, though we've both said to each other that we're happy, and I'll now say to you, we'd be both quite happy to entertain questions on any subject or any aspect that's raised by this discussion, but I think for now we do have to address ourselves to the rubric of the motion. And I have the fairly easy task of restating rather than asserting. I think that the very idea of Europe and European civilization as we have molded and conceived it and shaped it for ourselves is intimately bound up, indissolubly, I should say, imbricated with the ideas of secularism, what the French call laicity, what the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which comes very largely from work done in Europe and by European thinkers and philosophers, refers to informally, based as it is on the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom written by Thomas Jefferson, as the separation of church and state, that these things are both sufficient and necessary conditions for Europe to flourish, to grow, to expand and to spread itself as an idea and as a political concept, and as an alternative to other forms of national and international supranational association. I feel a bit depressed starting on such an uncontroversial note, but it has to be done, and someone has to do it, and that someone has to be me. Perhaps I'd step more into the field of disputation, where I feel a little happier if I say what I want to say next, which is that today we can see the assumptions of this civilization, and in fact its continued survival and prosperity being threatened in several ways by a recrudescence in various forms of what I'll call theocracy, or the idea that there shouldn't be a separation between church and state, that faith should be, so to say, legislated politically. Now, the most salient of these is well known to us all here, and it's the Islamist challenge. There are innumerable ways of phrasing this. Let me try a thought experiment for you and on you. Until a few years ago, and possibly now in the process of being revived by a sinister formation called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, North Africa. there was very nearly a military victory for a jihadist insurgency in Algeria. Not only did this lead to the deaths of not less than 150, perhaps as many as 180,000 Algerians, and the mutilation and homelessness and eviction and torture of many more, the bulk of the population having been excommunicated by the jihadists as having become un-Islamic, a process known as takfir, a very sinister process that's increasingly common of just writing off whole populations as essentially unclean. Now, what you have to imagine is if the Algerian army, the FLN, its ruling party, some of its civil society, its Berber minority, its women and many others, hadn't in the end succeeded in defeating that insurgency, what would have happened would have been, apart from a total disaster and the return of Algeria to something like the Middle Ages, the leaving across the Mediterranean of many, many millions of Algerians in a hurry and in some destitution to France. And that in turn would have meant, in my submission, tremendous political and moral chaos in France, and very, very thinkably, the election in France of a chauvinist Catholic party, the Front National, the National Front, the racist and xenophobic party of Monsieur Le Pen, in reaction, so to speak. In other words, the stability, the stability and prosperity and exceptionalism in which we take such justified pride and which appears to us to have such deep roots is in fact rather fragile and could be subjected at any moment to stresses and strains and challenges of a kind that are quite sobering to contemplate. And I intend no alarmism in what I say about this instance in France, because it's perfectly easy to see the fairly delicate balance of religious cooperation between religions as well as among them. In Holland, for example, where the whole state and society is built on a compromise between Protestant and Catholic. In Belgium, in Italy, in Germany, the demands are being made now that there should be separate schools for a certain religious minority, separate consideration made for their sensitivities under law, changes made in the law governing censorship and free expression in favor of one named religious minority. We're not immune to this suggestion in our own country. And that these demands are backed by a believable threat of violence, which is what makes them, in this context, unprecedented. And by what I regard as the very alarming tendency of civil society to try and buy civil peace by conceding, crying before it's hurt, conceding in principle and in practice to that implied threat. I'll take the single case of Denmark, a small country, Northern European democracy, no threat, never has been a threat to anybody, subjected to an international boycott of its products, to the burning of its embassies, the attacks of its diplomats, usually in cities like Tripoli and Damascus, where demonstrations are not normally allowed at all, put down by the army or the police. Suddenly very large and very violent demonstrations not put down, leading to the burning of Danish property, the violation of Danish diplomatic immunity, attempt to wreck the Danish economy, all because the Prime Minister of Denmark would not break his own country's law and subject an afternoon paper called Jyllands-Posten in Copenhagen to censorship for publishing cartoons that touched on the figure of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Now, not only did this very well orchestrated plan of violence and subversion take the form that I've just told you that it did, it also took the form of the foreign ministers and embassies of every so-called Islamic country, from Turkey to Tunisia to Algeria to Indonesia, forming up on the Danish Prime Minister as if they were representing not countries or nations in his capital city, but a bloc, a religious clerical bloc, forcing him, with this language of threat and violence, to try and change his own law. This is a very, very major threat, and I hope it requires no further underlining from me. I've got a little more to say under that heading when I've gone a little further with my tour d'horizon. The second, which I thought of introducing first, but I thought it would be opportunist to do so, but was going to mention anyway, is the revival of great Russian imperialism, what we used to call great Russian chauvinism, particularly under the presidency of Vladimir Putin, former KGB goon from the German Democratic Republic, as it was laughingly known, East Germany. It's been unmistakable whether it's pressure brought by Russia on the pipeline that runs through Ukraine, or the pressure brought by them on the former Baltic republics that were the once part of Russia under the terms, interestingly enough, of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. I'm referring to Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, repeatedly under Russian threat for their independence, to the bullying of Poland for its decision to have a missile defense system installed on its soil, to the very lurid intervention in the territories, the Georgian territories of Ossetia and Abkhazia that became so obvious to us this morning and would have been, I think, described as unilateralism at least, if not imperialism, for its flagrant refusal to consult the United Nations if it had been committed by the United States. But what is very seldom pointed out about this great Russian chauvinism and its recrudescence is it is essentially a phenomenon of militant Russian orthodoxy. What is the bond that makes this Russia's revenge in Ossetia and Abkhazia? Essentially, the revenge for Kosovo. Comes from their solidarity with Slobodan Milosevic. Where does that solidarity come from? From a solidarity of Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox brotherhood, which also pits them against Polish Catholics, Estonian Protestants, other kinds of Christian, Jews, and of course, Muslims. If you saw President Medvedev, the hand-picked successor of Vladimir Putin, taking his oath the other day, you would perhaps have noticed it wasn't sufficiently stressed. I thought that he had to do so by kissing an icon that was held out to him by the Orthodox Patriarch. The Orthodox Church in Russia not only demands Russian solidarity with Orthodox forces abroad, an Orthodox alliance, so to speak, mainly symbolized in the support for the Orthodox genocide against Catholics and humanists and Muslims in the Balkans. But it also demands within Russia an Orthodox monopoly. Other churches may not proselytize, even if they're Christian. Non-Christian churches, or non-Christian religions, Judaism and Islam in particular, are subject to fairly gross forms of persecution. It's important to remember also the history of this black-cowled, clerical, power-hungry, monopolistic church. Remember, it was from the ranks of that degraded Christianity that we received the texts of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the fabrication that did so much to poison not just white Russian history and life, but the whole of European history and culture and life too, when it was adopted by National Socialism as a sort of secular Bible. So this is a threat that demands a great deal more attention and understanding and resistance than it's so far been getting. I don't think I need waste very many words on the forces. There are some of them in Britain, there are some of them in Germany and Scandinavia as well, who've tried to import an American-style evangelism to Europe and tried to hold up or taint or pollute the teaching of science to our children by proposing the nonsense of creationism instead of the lucid and objective study of evolution by natural selection. It would be as if to say, well, children, we've had the chemistry class now. I hope you'll get your books out for the alchemy period after the break. Now we've studied astronomy. We'll be doing astrology after lunch. Don't let it happen here. And don't catch yourself referring to the stupid movement that is paying for this and trying to insinuate itself as a creationist movement. Don't call it by the name they want you to call it. Don't call it intelligent design. It may have been rather crudely designed, but there's nothing intelligent about it. And one of the ways in which they sell it is to try and get it called by this fancy name for creationism. Then I'd have to say there's a fourth threat, and it's, I don't want to sound melodramatic, but it's an enemy within. It's the capitulation of our actually existing Christian churches, the ones that we hardly notice, the ones that we take for granted. That wonderful man who does that near faultless impersonation of a sheep, the Right Reverend Rowan Williams, for example, who in his innocuous way says, how much would it hurt? A man whose current head of the church is, of course, our sovereign lady, the Queen, but the moment her brave old heart ceases to beat, the head of his church will be Prince Charles, a bat-eared Muslim fancier with no taste in women, who says he wants to be now defender of all faiths. This is what you get if you found a church on the family values of Henry VIII, of course. But I don't want to be told by the man who so aptly goes by the pseudonym of Cantuar that a little Sharia law might be just what the British people now need in this their hour of extremity, and I didn't need to be told by His Holiness the Pope either that Islamism could only be repudiated in a crusader-loving speech based on the demagogy of a Byzantine emperor with which he managed to inflame Muslim opinion most recently, but not only that, his attempt to rebase his church in the most traditionalist and most reactionary preachments, but then his acting in his capacity as head of a state, the Vatican, by inviting as ambassadors and plenipotentiaries all the leaders of the Muslim countries to come to negotiate with him as if they had the right, as a religious and clerical bloc, to intervene in the internal affairs of Europe. And that the reaction of the Vatican and of its newspaper, the Osservatore Romano, to the outrageous attacks on the people and republic and constitution of democratic European Denmark was to condemn not the violations of diplomatic immunity, not the incitements to violence, not the economic sabotage, but the publication of the cartoons themselves, because they could be held to offend faith. And in the view of His Holiness, any faith is better than none at all, which is precisely the motion, if you like, or the proposition that we are here met to dispute. I will add, and I can tell that I've got a minute to wrap, that in his recent youth festivals, both in Germany and outside European borders in Australia, the Pope has revived the practice of offering indulgences, temporary or plenary indulgences, remission from time to be spent in a future purgatorial state, to those who are willing to attend and testify to his role as the Holy Father of his Church. Now, if there is probably one moment at which the idea of the European Enlightenment began to assert itself and to be able to give itself a name and to be able to call itself a reformation, it was the moment when the sale of indulgences was denounced by Martin Luther as a deceitful and a blasphemous and a scandalous practice. And to see it coming back by someone who is in the meantime willing to sell the European idea to a kind of counter-ecumenical alliance with Muslim extremists is, I think, sufficient warning of what we have to face if we're serious about defending and preserving our own heritage as free and democratic people and passing it on to those who come after us. Fire cannot be fought by fire. It can't be fought with Byzantine incantations, in other words, or with Crusader nostalgia, but even less can the clerical bullying and the theocratic challenge be met by appeasement or by capitulation. It needs instead to be met with a very firm, humorous, by all means, tolerant, broad-minded, but firm and determined reassertion of secularism as a core principle of our democracy and our internationalism. And I think it would be a wonderful thing if this great hall in this great and famous and ancient city of Edinburgh could be thought of as one of the times and places where that fight back began to occur and proclaim itself. So it's in that hope and with great pride, and many thanks to you for your invitation, that I propose the motion standing in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Professor John Lennox.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am an Ulster Scot. I think a few hundred years ago there was some kind of clan dispute in Scotland, and those of us who lost went to Northern Ireland, and those who didn't drown survived. So I'm delighted and honoured to be invited here to discuss with Christopher Hitchens this motion. Being brought up in Northern Ireland, at school I was fortunate to have a brilliant languages teacher, and he gave me a passion for languages which opened up for me the wide world of European culture. I have worked at 3 foreign universities, and I have traveled extensively in the 1970s, both in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And so I think of myself very easily and excitedly as a citizen of the new Europe as well as a UK citizen. And I look at the new Europe and I see that it presents us with great opportunities, but also considerable challenges, as we've just heard, as to how we handle diversity. There are dangers from extremist ideologies, both religious and secular. Christopher Hitchens claims that religion poisons everything, and there is substance to his charge. In fact, I find myself in agreement with almost everything he said this morning. I too am appalled by religious bigotry. I too am appalled at exploitation and violence and blurring of the distinction between politics and religion. Now, the new atheists direct fire at a number of religions, but mainly on Christianity. And as a Christian, I'm going to concentrate there, because other religions will rightly wish to speak for themselves. Now, the blanket statement, religion poisons everything, followed by a litany of the evils of religion, is about as useful as saying science poisons everything, followed by a litany of the evils of science, poisoning the environment and creating napalm and poison gas. Abuse must be distinguished from use. Abolishing religion, after all, to get rid of its abuse is about as intelligent as abolishing science to get rid of pollution, or abolishing money to get rid of greed. I want to be very open with you. As a Christian, I am ashamed that the name of Christ has been associated with violence and war. Because those who fight in the name of Christ, far from obeying him, are disobeying his explicit commands. He forbade the use of physical violence to protect him or to further his message. As he said to Pilate, I have come to bear witness to the truth. Truth, religious or secular, ladies and gentlemen, cannot be imposed by force. After all, it was Christ who said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God, on which the separation between church and state is based. Now, here's a puzzle. Since the new atheists claim to be against religious violence, they should be applauding Christ, as I see it, for his denunciation of hypocritical and abusive religion, and for his insistence on the highest standards of morality. I'm afraid the new atheists confuse the essential message of Christianity by the horrific abuses of Christendom. Because after all, Christian teaching is foundational to European civilization. The prominent German thinker Jürgen Habermas, who calls himself a methodological atheist, says Christianity and nothing else is the ultimate foundation of liberty, conscience, human rights, and democracy, the benchmarks of Western civilization. To this day, we've no other option than Christianity. We continue to nourish ourselves from this source. Everything else is postmodern chatter. Ironically, Christianity gave Europe its universities that educated the new atheists, the liberty that permits them to propagate their views, and the law that protects them. As influential intellectual atheist John Gray points out, the new atheists defend liberal freedoms without asking where they come from. Now, perhaps they don't ask because they so exalt science that they just don't take history seriously. They assert, for instance, that the very existence of Jesus is disputed by scholars. But I don't see that they've checked with ancient historians, since the existence of Jesus doesn't appear to be in dispute with them. Professor Graham Clark, the author of the chapter on Christianity in the Cambridge Ancient History, who's not a Christian, says, frankly, I know of no ancient historian who would have a twinge of doubt about the existence of Jesus Christ. Such a cavalier attitude to history does nothing, in my view, to enhance new atheism's claim to intellectual high ground. Now, that brings me to another major issue in this debate. The new atheists ask us, with John Lennon, to imagine a world without religion, a world free from religious violence. But you may have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox. And I would invite the new atheists to imagine a world without atheism, without the Gulag, without the killing fields, without the Cultural Revolution, a world without Stalin, Pol Pot, or Mao. Now, the disturbing thing is that leading new atheist Richard Dawkins says that atheism has nothing to do with such atrocities. He says he doesn't know of an atheist who would bulldoze cathedrals like Chartres and Notre Dame. Yet that was precisely what Stalin did on a large scale. But it's not just atrocities that worry me, ladies and gentlemen, but the effect on education. I sat with a 13-year-old girl in the former German Democratic Republic on the day that she was told she couldn't have any more education since she was not prepared to swear public allegiance to the atheistic state. One is tempted to call that intellectual murder. It was committed many times, because the fact is that atheism and communism are inseparable. In Marxism, the criticism of religion was the foundation of all criticism. God had to go, and intellectual murder followed. In the GDR, the choice was simple. It was either atheism or no higher education. And in many other countries, atheism could be taught to children, whereas Christian parents and churches were not allowed to teach their faith to children and young people. Now, is this what the new atheists wish to see again in Europe? They need to tell us clearly, because by using terms like child abuse in connection with the religious teaching of children by their parents, child abuse being a criminal offense, they raise the specter of days gone by, or at least days that we hoped had gone by. Nor is the new atheist cause helped by their attempt to enlist science, wrongly believing it to be the only way to truth. Christopher Hitchens says again, thanks to the telescope or the microscope, religion no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Well, that sounds like tunnel vision to me. And Wittgenstein would have said to it, I think, that the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. In particular, as Nobel Prize winner Sir Peter Medawar said, science cannot answer the questions of a child, what we are here for and what is the meaning of life. The irony is that it is Christianity that gave the new atheists and everyone else the impulse to do science. Most of the great European pioneers of science believed in God. Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton. All of them expected to find law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, it wasn't simply that they believed in order. It was the specific belief in a rational creator that drove their faith that science could be done by rational human beings made in the image of God. And the new atheists are therefore wrong in thinking that faith is not involved in either their science or their atheism. Faith for them is an irrational religious concept that rejoices in the absence of evidence. This confusion of faith with blind faith leads them to make wonderful statements like Christopher Hitchens, our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not of faith. This statement is intriguingly followed by its negation. We distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. Sounds a bit oxymoronic to me. You see, the irony is this, that faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe is essential to all science. Yet the new atheism must have that faith in themselves, but they have no grounds for it. Because if the human mind has been cobbled together by mindless, unguided processes, as they say, why should we trust our cognitive faculties and the validity of any belief they produce, atheism and science included? John Gray is no friend of Christianity, and yet he says modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. And reducing thought to nothing but neurophysiology spells an end to rationality, but seems to be the price you have to pay for the new atheism. God doesn't compete with science. Science didn't put the universe there, God did. God is the explanation of why we can do science. Yet constantly, the new atheists set up in Europe the idea that it's either God or science. That is a naive thing to do, even if you're an atheist, because people just might be tempted to choose God and therefore end up being sadly more scientifically illiterate than they were before. When Newton discovered the law of gravitation, he didn't say, "Wonderful, science explain it, therefore I don't need God." After all, are we really to think that understanding the laws of internal combustion makes it impossible to believe in Henry Ford? No, Newton wrote the Principia Mathematica, one of the most brilliant works of science in history, with the intention of persuading thinking people to believe in God. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you will understand that I can scarcely recommend such an anti-scientific blind faith to the new Europe. It makes infinitely more sense to me as a scientist to believe that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and all things were made by Him. Rationality does not come from irrationality. Sense does not come from nonsense. But finally, the big question of the new atheism and ethics. We don't need God to be good, claim the new atheists. Well, of course, atheists can be good. Sometimes they shame me. My theism teaches me that. Since all people are made in the image of God, they possess an innate sense of morality, whether they believe in God or not. On the other hand, atheism doesn't explain how we all regard certain things as absolutely wrong, like torturing children. Nor does it explain the passion of new atheism's moral outrage. How could random events and blind natural selection possibly account for the absoluteness of the values that justify such intolerance of faith? It's pretty hard to defend absolute morals on anything other than religious grounds, as Richard Dawkins says. But it's actually pretty hard, ladies and gentlemen, to defend any morality whatsoever if we follow him a little further. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. It just is, and we dance to its music. So good and evil don't exist. If a rock fall kills a climber, it makes no sense calling the rock evil. It just exists. If Pol Pot chooses to eliminate 1 million intellectuals, how could you call him evil if he was simply dancing to his DNA? Moreover, if good and evil don't exist, and as Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson tell us, ethics is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate, it is absurd for the new atheists to say that God is a monster or God isn't great. Far from their atheism delivering an explanation for morality, it dissolves it like acid. But worse still, new atheism has no hope of justice. The new atheists react vehemently against the idea that God pursues justice after death. Yet they claim to take morality seriously. This makes no sense. If there is no final accountability after death, then a Hitler can shoot his way to oblivion after murdering millions and ultimately get away with it. According to atheism, no terrorist victim will ever see justice done. Their moral sense and their desire for justice will prove to have been a hideous illusion. There is no hope. That, to me, ladies and gentlemen, is the ultimate moral outrage. Yet the new atheists say that religion is childish, like sucking on a dummy for baseless comfort. But what about their atheism? Polish Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz says, "A true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged." Christianity teaches, ladies and gentlemen, that justice will be done by a judge whose appointment has been confirmed by his physical resurrection from the dead, so that faith in God is based on solid historical evidence. Christianity therefore upholds the values written on the consciences of all human beings, whether or not they believe in God, the values on which the freedoms of the new Europe depend. Ladies and gentlemen, the new atheism is fatally flawed in its attitude to reason, science, history, ethics, and justice. I submit to you it is false. I therefore oppose the motion noting in passing that its use of the ethical term should makes the motion logically incoherent for a new atheist anyway.
Leaving aside the assault on the motion setter for some kind of syllogism in there, two splendid opening statements. You've each got 5 minutes to rebut. Just keep it on the good side of 5, Christopher, if you can.
Now, I don't normally need 5 minutes to rebut the resurrection. And I don't know what I'd do with the remainder of my time. I think what I'm going to have to do instead is make, because we've only got 5, is a couple of factual corrections and then a rebuttal on one of Professor Lennox's main, if not his main point. Small correction, Jesus of Nazareth said he came not to bring peace but a sword. And there's every evidence that he and his disciples meant by that what any person would have assumed they were meant to mean from it, take from it. The European university system owes probably as much to Islam in its early formation as to Christianity. It was, after all, through Andalusia and by way of Baghdad that Europe was allowed to rediscover the texts of Aristotle and many other elements of Greek learning that had actually been nearly obliterated by Christianity as profane. But this enormous contribution that was made by Islam goes nowhere towards proving the truth of any Islamic proposition. It just happens to be a fact about the cultural underlay of the continent, as is the unarguable fact that Christianity was something that everyone had to have an attitude to. After all, until very recently, practically in living memory, you couldn't be the holder of any post at Oxford or Cambridge University unless you were in holy orders. So I'm not going to deny that Christianity had a big influence on our university system. One of the people who opposed that, by the way, was Isaac Newton, who said you couldn't be and shouldn't be allowed to be a Catholic, who said that the doctrine of the Trinity was absolute nonsense, who thought that the only real source of knowledge would be if we could discover what the real proportions of Solomon's temple had been, and could work out a great deal more from that if we could do it than from mere studies of gravitation. I'm just going to the point about religious beliefs as held by men of science. You might have added that Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen, believed in the phlogiston theory, that Alfred Russel Wallace, who did a great deal of Darwin's work for him, certainly his greatest collaborator, was never happier than when going to spiritualist seances. The amount of superstition and extraordinary crackpot belief evidenced by supposed men of science has always been a very great source of wonder. It doesn't prove any point. It's just very interesting to observe. I would say myself that not until Albert Einstein do you get a marriage of science and, so to say, pure mind. And Einstein bases himself on the very familiar propositions, essentially of Spinoza, a form of pantheism, barely even definable as deism, and certainly not as any kind of theism. And we're fortunate to have had a very long letter, you've probably read about it, by him, written in German to a scientist friend in the 1930s, making absolutely clear his complete contempt for all forms of religious belief or the idea that there is a personal God or an intervening deity or anything of that category or description. These are just by way of slight clean-up points on some of the wilder assertions made.
Just up quite a bit of your time, so
I know. What I'm going to be quick about is this, is the concept of a secular totalitarianism. I have a couple of points to make. First is that religion is totalitarian in itself and in principle. It tells you that you are subject, or should be, or would be better if you were, subject to a constant round-the-clock surveillance and supervision and invigilation that goes on while you're asleep, it starts before you're born, and most importantly of all, goes on after you are dead, and that can convict you, this big brother system, of thought crime. Again, even while you're asleep, or having a thought you didn't even know you were going to have, and that will lead to eternal damnation. That's a totalitarian principle from which there is no appeal. It's an unalterable system of power and domination. I'm very relieved to be able to tell you that there's no evidence at all for believing there's any truth to it. But those who say they believe it are recommending to you a totalitarian solution. If Joseph Stalin, looking at what Russia had been like for the preceding few centuries, had not noticed that the principle of rule was that the head of the government was also the head of the church. The Tsar, not exactly divine, was a little more than human, was known as the Holy Father. The Little Father was a bit more than just a king. That he'd been given, communism had been given an enormous reservoir of servility and credulity on which to draw, gifted to it by these generations of Russian Orthodox totalitarianism. If Stalin hadn't noticed this huge advantage conferred on him, he shouldn't have really been in the dictatorship business at all. And of course, what happens? Well, the first is an inquisition, show trials where the defendants cannot possibly be guilty enough, certainly can't be innocent, but have to keep on confessing to more and more crazy heresies. The worship of an all-powerful leader from whom all blessings flow. The provision of miracles in the form of Lysenko's biology that proposed 10-pound tomatoes and half hundredweight potatoes and 3 harvests a year and other kinds of madness and nonsense to keep the faithful in life. The constant invocation of the devil, always ready to trap the unwary and to lead them from the path of righteousness. You can see it all. You can see it even more classically in the case of today's North Korea, the most perfectly totalitarian state in the world, the most self-sealingly Orwellian in the world, where when President Bush writes to Kim Jong-il, he has to call him Dear Mr. Chairman because he's not Mr. President. He's only the head of the party of North Korea and the army. The presidency is held by his father, Kim Il-sung, who's been dead for 15 years. So North Korea, you might say, is a mausolocracy, or a necrocracy, or a thanatocracy. Anyway, it's one short of a trinity. That's the thing I'm drawing your attention to. Now, for this test to be safe, for it to be fair, for it to be objective, this test of secularism and its relationship to the totalitarian, this will be my closing sentence. The following thing would have to happen. You'd have to compare like with like. In other words, you couldn't compare one bunch of faith-based communist thugs taking power in a country that had already been reduced to beggary by theocracy. You'd have to take a country that adopted the teachings of David Hume, Baruch Spinoza, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Bertrand Russell, and decide that these were the values, that these were the principles of separation and secularism by which it was going to live. Then you'd have to show that this society, because of adopting those thinkers, had fallen into famine and slavery and beggary and serfdom and torture and backwardness. And I don't think you'd be able to run that test with any expectation of it turning out that way. But then I don't see how you could have listened to 10 seconds for someone who talks of people who bore great names like that and regards them as princes of injustice and cruelty, and reminds us, in other words, of precisely the kind of religious backwardness from which we've so painfully had to escape. Thank you.
Thank you. You can have the same time.
I think this could be the start of a very interesting conversation. Jesus didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. That's absolutely right. And the sword was a division in those who were prepared to accept him and trust him, and those who would reject him. The fact that he didn't mean a physical sword is perfectly clear from the occasion when his disciples took swords to defend him. And he said, "Put your swords away. People that live by the sword will perish by the sword." He didn't resist arrest. Pilate knew that. And the turning point in the conversation with Pilate, because Pilate was extremely concerned, was this a political revolutionary, a man of violence? And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world, either because if it were, my servants would have been fighting." And Pilate publicly exonerated him from the charge. So it seems to me that it's very clear what Jesus meant by that. Secondly, I take your point completely about the transmission of Aristotle and so on through the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a place that interests me greatly. Islam, of course, I do notice is a monotheistic religion, and nothing in that nuance, and I accept it, alters the point that I was making. But to come to your third point, you mentioned the sort of wacky beliefs that some scientists had, like Newton and Russell Wallace and so on. I'm not talking about wacky beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking about a very serious intellectual thesis. And that is, what is it caused science to explode in the 16th and 17th centuries? It's often called Whitehead's thesis. Men became scientific because they expected law of nature, and they expected law of nature because they believed in the lawgiver. And Joseph Needham, who was a Marxist, wondered why science did not explode in China. There was a lot of technology, and he said the problem was this: they didn't have the notion of a rational creator so that science could be done by rational human beings. I'm not talking about this wackiness, and we need to distinguish. All of us can have some very wacky ideas. I'm talking about a central thesis that comes out of the perfectly comprehensible biblical doctrine that there is a creator. You see, in this contemporary world, we have brilliant people like Jim Watson and Francis Collins. Jim Watson directed the Human Genome Project. He's an atheist. Francis Collins has just stepped down from directing it. He is a Christian. They are men of undoubted highest scientific qualifications, but the things that they disagree on are not science, either in high science or its wacky points. The thing that's at stake here in this whole debate is the differentiation between worldviews. Jim Watson is an atheist. Francis Collins is a Christian. And the problem is we've so distorted this debate, ladies and gentlemen, that we feel that it's a debate science versus religion. It isn't that at all. That's clearly so because you see scientists on both sides. The real debate is between atheism and theism, and we need to distinguish those two carefully. Now, the idea of God as a bully, and in reading your book, I found myself really quite sad in the sense that I can understand that if people have had a very negative experience of God, they can sense that God watching them and overseeing them and so on is a very dangerous thing and a very terrifying thing. But you see, it depends on what side of the fence you're on. The people that perished in the gas chambers, the notion of God watching over them would be a very precious thing. You see, I could describe marriage, ladies and gentlemen, as a terrible thing. There's a woman in my house and she watches all that I do and she sees everything and so on. And I could write off marriage for that reason. You see, the trouble is God watching over us has two sides. Firstly, the care and attention, which is foundational to me in my life and in my family life. Secondly, the fact that there's a God watching means there's going to be justice. Because Stalin, whatever the complicated mixture of religion and power politics was in his heart, the one thing, as David Berlinski, a mathematician and an agnostic Jew, pointed out in his recent book, is this: neither Hitler, Stalin, or Pol Pot, or any of the others, thought that God was watching them. I wish they had.
Thank you. I want to ask our two participants to sum up with as much brevity as they can summon. 3 or 4 minutes, John Lennox, 3 or 4 minutes, Christopher Hitchens. John.
Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that concerns me about the new atheists is that they're soft atheists. That is, they try to retain the values bequeathed to them by Christianity whilst espousing atheism. Hard atheists like Nietzsche, Camus, and Sartre would tell them that it isn't possible in the long run to jettison the source of the values, Christianity, and retain the values. Thoroughgoing atheism will logically demand the ultimate destruction of all values. As one Eastern European intellectual put it to me, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. Our history has proved us wrong. We got rid of God and destroyed man. Now, the world's leading ethicist, Peter Singer, has grasped the logical implications of atheism. He writes, "A newborn baby has no more value than a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee." Now, I challenge the new atheists, and I did this in another way earlier, but I didn't get a response. I challenge the new atheists to tell us, is this where they're taking us? And if it isn't, how will they resist ending up believing with John Gray that human beings are no more significant than slime mold? My second point is this. I have a passion for an open public square in Europe that encourages people of different worldviews to sit at the same table, neither afraid nor paralyzed by political correctness or intemperate language to say what they believe. The shrill intolerance of extremists of both kinds, religious and secular, threatens the existence of such a public square. My worry is I'm not convinced that the new atheists wish to preserve our freedom to do that in public or even at home, because the new atheism appears to share with fundamentalist religion a frightening degree of intolerance. They talk about Enlightenment values, even calling themselves the Brights. But it was the Enlightenment thinkers who began to argue that those who could not be educated or reformed should be eliminated, a view that set the stage for the 20th century. None of us wants another reign of terror. Yet Sam Harris, one of the new atheist leaders, writes, "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them." Will it be the new atheists, ladies and gentlemen, who in the end decide what those propositions are? And in any case, it's very strange, as John Gray says, that the new atheists wish to deny expression to something as peculiarly human as religious faith. The persistence of faith in God in Europe, to say nothing of its steady growth in the rest of the world, makes nonsense of the new atheists' claim to explain it in terms of a mindless process that, on their own confession, is interested only in survival and not truth. Such a process would surely have eliminated religion long ago. The irony is, as Wolfhard Pannenberg has said, secular culture produces a deep need for meaning in life and therefore for religion. But I'm very encouraged to read that Christopher Hitchens says that he would not prohibit religion even if he thought he could. He then asked, "Will the religious grant me the same indulgence?" I most certainly will. Indeed, I'm more than happy to discriminate between different kinds of atheists. For instance, those who would prohibit religion like Stalin and those who wouldn't. Of course, I'd like to see that working both ways. I would ask the new atheists to distinguish between religions, because to lump the Taliban with the peace-loving Amish really amounts to saying that you're not really interested in reason or evidence. Finally, there's nothing new about the new atheism. For over 40 years, a version of it dominated Europe, some parts for longer, and it was rejected in 1989. Now, far from hindering the formation of the new Europe, Christianity helped create it. The president of the British Academy, Sir Adam Roberts, professor of international relations at Oxford, is a world authority in the Cold War and the role of religion in resistance movements. He points out that in 1989 in Leipzig, the Christian churches played the crucial role in preventing the violence that would have given the GDR an excuse to send in the troops and threaten Gorbachev's policy of allowing democracy to have its way. Sir Adam emphasized recently that if the churches had not acted as they did, the outcome might well have been disastrous. There wouldn't have been a new Europe. So the very existence of the new Europe is an example of how genuine Christianity, in its insistence on the dignity of human beings made in the image of God, brings freedom. The new atheism threatens to undermine those freedoms. I give the last word to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who died this week. If I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to say, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Ladies and gentlemen, it was only because the wall created by the previous version of the new atheism was pulled down that the new Europe can exist. Do we really want to build another wall? Thank you.
Thank you. Last word, Christopher Hitchens.
I think the question that intrigues me the most always when I'm debating with people like Professor Lennox is, how do they know all this? What source of information does Professor Lennox have that I don't have? He hasn't been able to indicate that there's something he knows that I could know if only I had faith. And so one sometimes feels as if one is punching air. After all, my opinions are, even if they're as erroneous as the professor says, very well advertised to you and very intelligible. There's no invisible means of support that I'm appealing to here. Now, it would be worse, in my view, if the supervision that I was talking about was benign. if it was all done for your own good, if this totalitarian Big Brother thought crime system was as benign as the professor wants it to be, for example. He says, wouldn't it have been nice for those entering the fire and hell of the Nazi final solution to think that God was watching them and seeing it all? Well, you know what their Orthodox rabbis told them, the faith in which they themselves believed, was that this was happening to them because they had turned away from God. The Holocaust, the final solution, was a punishment for exile from Palestine and from turning away from the Torah. So if you find that kind of divine assurance and presence a relief and a humane one, you're entitled to, but you're still letting yourself off what the real implications of religious belief are. And that's why I'm glad that this debate has turned into one that's somewhat less about Europe and somewhat more about ideas. And I'll take up another couple of your points if I may. Jesus offers vicarious redemption, what used to be called scapegoating or human sacrifice. He says, throw your sins on me, I'll take them, and your sins will cease to be yours. Now, those of us who are not religious regard that as an immoral preachment as well as a fantastic one. I can pay your debt if you're in debt. I can take your debt on myself and pay it for you. In very extreme conditions, I could offer to serve someone's sentence in prison. Great humanists have indeed done that, or even to take someone's place before a firing squad. Great humanists have done that too. But I can't take your sins away from you, because essential to the concept of human decency and integrity is that very individual idea that you are responsible. I can't take your responsibilities away. So the offer that's being made by the offer of vicarious redemption is a cancellation, a negation of responsibility. It's an immoral one by definition. And note something else. If you don't choose to avail yourself of this beautiful offer, you're told, well, we can't make you do it, but we can promise you an eternity of punishment for not accepting this immoral offer. Now, not even in the Old Testament, which does recommend child abuse, which does recommend genocide, which does often mandate slavery and mass killing and things of this kind, when God and his agents are done with you in the Old Testament and the earth is closed over you, that's it. You're gone. The punishment has been exacted. Only with gentle Jesus, meek and mild, is the concept of eternal, unending punishment of the dead introduced. This is not nonviolence. This is not beauty. This is not compassion. And it also raises the question, how does anyone know these things happen? How do we know? The professor invites the question himself. How do we know that the Hindu hells, which go on in different ways to please different gods, aren't also right? Because if they're right, the Christian ones are wrong. How do we know that the Jewish Orthodox are wrong about the resurrection? Or how do we know that they aren't right about it, and so forth? To the point where, when you factored in all the other monotheisms and polytheisms, that the greatest number of people, by far the majority of all religious believers in the world that there have ever been, must have been wrong, at least in the terms of all the other religions. Wrong enough, in fact, to be beyond salvation. So that this is a system of moral chaos that's being proposed, designed really to gratify the solipsism and the selfishness of certain communities who congratulate themselves on having a hotline to a deity, a designer, a big brother, or a creator. Now, just to this point of Solzhenitsyn and the claims that religion has done all these emancipating things. Sometimes he's parade and aid. I'm sorry to say he ended as a great supporter of Vladimir Putin's Russian Orthodox tyranny. Sometimes it's Dr. Martin Luther King who's preferred, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You know the usual examples. I have a sort of challenge that I have put now in print several times, in public, at many debates, and on radio and on television. I haven't so far had a response to the first one, and it has a corollary which I'll come to. You are to imagine a moral or ethical action performed, or a moral or ethical statement made, utterance given, that is offered to you by a person of faith. Okay? And now you have to think of it being impossible for the same action to be performed, or the same moral statement made by someone who is an unbeliever. So you have to find something, a good thing, a virtuous thing, a noble thing, that I couldn't do or say. That's all you have to do. And I haven't so far had anyone come up with an example of what that might be, which of course would make absolute nonsense of the claims advanced by Professor Lennox. But here's my corollary, and it's much less demanding. You have to think of a wicked thing done or a wicked thing said that's done specifically because of religious faith. Okay? You've already thought of one. I rest my case for now. Thank you so much for all your kindness and hospitality.
Christopher Hitchens, John Lennox, thank you both. Thank you. I do want to put this to a vote, but I also want to check the don't knows as well. The motion is that the new Europe should prefer the new atheism. Will those who are in favour please show? And will those who are against please show? I'm going to count this again in a moment. Let's see the don't knows, who've diminished greatly since the beginning. Let's look at this. It's very, very close. We don't have the facility
I think
to count.
Professor Lennox got the majority.
Well, I think, let's just check again. Those in favour of the motion? And those against? I declare the motion lost. Thank you very much indeed for your attendance.
Congratulations.
Goodbye.
So you've heard Hitchens and Lennox make their arguments for a Europe with and without God. You've heard them invoke science, history, philosophy, and theology, and it's easy to conclude from this that these are questions that only concern intellectuals. But the reality is that they concern all of us. They're questions of human society. They're questions of existence.